All right, all right. Can we recompose ourselves again? The time is now. We are all set. We are all set for the gist of the matter. Actually, the morning presentation set us in motion. We heard from the horse's mouth. We have not also heard from many other mouths. But for now, we are going to dedicate this next panel discussion hearing briefly to some three eminent voices when we talk about human trafficking, forced migration, gender equality. We can't miss the Department of Refugees under the office of the Prime Minister, telling us a little story about how they're faring with their databases, from asylees to refugees to deportees and perhaps to returnees. Because that conversation, I think, is very much linked to the vulnerabilities of those who become yesterday's displaced people, tomorrow's trafficked, exploited after tomorrow. We shall also hear from the commissioner himself, who has graced us with his time and insights on speaking very briefly on the status of labor exporting companies. They will have very brief introductory remarks for 5 minutes each. We shall have the third panelist who is online. She has prepared for us a very generous video, and then we shall launch now Q&A. I suspect that there will be a lot to say in the question and answer session. So I will exhort my people to be very brief and expect that question and answer session will unpack most of their brief introductory notes. So without much ado, I will call on your attention to give them the ears and take notes, and then we shall launch a question and answer session. We will start with Commissioner Mondo. Commissioner Mondo Chateka, please take us through. It's sanitized.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I was told to talk about the status of the firms that participate in externalization of labor. But I felt that I'll make about 3 statements before I go to the firms. The first statement is that Uganda government does not and has never considered labor externalization as a panacea to the unemployment question in Uganda or anywhere else, but rather as a remedial intervention to contribute towards alleviating the problem, actually massaging the problem. And you know what massage does. It confuses the pain a little bit, but the pain will remain there. At least you get some relief. And I always see people going to the massage parlors when they have problems. Some of you remain here to go to the massage parlor here. It relieves the pain a little, but it does not solve the problem. So the same way, as government, we don't believe that externalization of labor is a panacea or it is a permanent solution to the unemployment question in this country. We rather believe that the actual answers to unemployment are bedrocked in a rapid economic growth via industrialization, commercial agricultural growth and development, service sector growth and development, quality education and skills development, able to produce a human capital that is able to compete on both the national and the global labor market. There lies the real solution. But that should be against a population growth that is 3 times slower in growth in comparison to the GDP growth, which is not the case for Uganda's economy. for you to be able to provide for the unemployment question in a rather sustainable manner, in addition to providing other services, your economy should grow 3 times faster than the population growth, which is not the case here. You and me are producing at 3.2% per annum, meaning that if we had to apply that economic factor, then our economy should grow percent for 10 years sustainably to be able to take care of all these children you manufacture every day and every night. Our economy rather is growing at between 5 and 6%, way below the 9.6%. And therefore, we still have this problem for some time. As long as you people have the appetite to produce children at that rate. And the problem is further compounded by the fact that the poor are producing more than you, the elite, and educated. And so poverty is going to continue, and I'm told that it moved away during the COVID period from 19.7 people who are living below the poverty line to 21.4%. I guess it could be a little higher even. But Minister of Finance says our people living below the poverty line stand at 21.4%. It's a big figure. Majority of them are, of course, the youth. Let me also point out that labor migration is as old as the existence of humankind. Some of you, like Patricia was telling me the other day, who read the Bible, either as often as I do, know when you read, you will see a lot of migration. Tribes migrating from here to there, and so migration has been there and will continue being there. The issue is why they are migrating, where they are going, and whether they are going is actually painted the way we normally believe, that it's greener pasture. Many times it's not. I've had the opportunity to travel outside the country and meet our people who are living in Japan, on Cheyo, living in USA, living in the UK. Really, okay, when they come back here, they look exotic. But when you meet them where they do their work, life is not as good as they paint it while they are here. Therefore, whereas we are reluctant to bank on labor externalization, we are forced because of the magnitude of unemployment in the country and the region at large. Externalization of labor is anchored within the National Employment Policy and Action Plan, and it's also provided for under the Employment Act 2006, guided by regulations entitled Employment Recruitment of Ugandans Migrant Workers Abroad, regulations of 2006. We have quite a number of companies because labor externalization, let me also put it crudely, is a business. And so people are in business of identifying unemployed people here, linking them with people who want labor outside this country. And so by yesterday, when I was writing my notes, we have 209 registered or licensed companies. 11 were disqualified due to a number of reasons. Some of them have taken some money for the exercise from the unsuspecting young people and not given them the employment they required. And some of them have not lived with the guidelines that have been given to them. They have operated outside those guidelines. So when we find out that you are doing things that are ultra-vires, then we have no option but to cancel your license. So over 11 farms have been in this category. The criterion for qualifying as a farm, one, is impeccable character in terms of not being with a record of crime and all these other things that we talk about, the repute and integrity of the company, and the company not participating in things that can endanger the security of the Republic of Uganda. How much is our annual remittances? It's about 600 million US dollars from these people within the Middle East. How many countries do we have bilateral agreement with? Like my colleague Rachel pointed out, we have bilaterals with Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. And when we talk about monitoring, this is where we can do the monitoring, because we have agreed with these countries that we are in this together. So there we do the monitoring. And later on I will tell you, and you know, that many of Ugandans are not going through these farms. They have chosen the shortcuts. That, you know, as Ugandans, we are interested in the shortcuts. Even when the compound is well labeled, and you can see there is grass here, there is a path here, you find even the educated stepping on the grass. And for people who love flowers, and I get very annoyed when you see somebody putting his legs and whatever somewhere else. But this is what they are doing. They get a shortcut through Nairobi, you know, with our borders that are porous. They find a way out. And if Mondo is making it difficult for them, stationing people, then they use the shortcut. And that's where we are getting the problem. And they go to countries even where we don't have a bilateral, like Qatar. Many of the cases we hear about, they have gone to Qatar and found problems there. Turkey and Bahrain. But these are on the list of the countries we are about to sign with, having agreed to the terms and conditions under which we relate. It's a bilateral. We have to mutually agree on what they have to do and what we have to do. For now, we have one labor liaison officer in UAE. We intend to have a labor liaison officer in all the countries with whom we have a bilateral. And that one will be part of our monitoring mechanism. Because it's expensive for my officers to come from Kampala to always go and monitor. But when we have a liaison officer, that one is the beginning point of monitoring. What is the current thinking? The current thinking is what I started with, is that externalization of labor is not a panacea. It's not a long-term solution to unemployment. The unemployment question must be answered in the areas that I talked about. I thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much for that opening remark. We are hearing a lot. I hope you are taking notes. We are going to listen to yet another officer from the Office of the Prime Minister.
Thank you. I was asked to talk about the database of the asylum seekers and refugees, deportees and returnees. But I will talk so much on the database of the refugees and asylum seekers. Maybe on the database of deportees and returnees, next time my colleague Agnes will be able to give this information for Ministry of Internal Affairs. since these people go or come through the Ministry of Internal Affairs. So the department has a total number of 1.4. The refugees and asylum seekers are 1,462,164. And these are settled in the settlements of Changwari, Rhino Camp. We also have Kampala. For the urban refugees, we have Bidibidi, we have Mvepi, we have Kriandongo, we have Ajumani, we have Chakatu, we have Nakivale, Olchinga, Parabek in Ramo, Parodinya in Obongi, we have Rwamwanja in Kamwenge, and Robude in Koboko. These refugees are registered in the database, which is biometric. They do biometric registration. They capture their 10 fingers and then they capture their iris. So we know who we have in the database as a refugee, and we know who is an asylum seeker. We have two types of the refugees. We have those ones who are granted prima facie status when they come in big numbers, in mass numbers. And then we have the ones who go through the individual status determination. Yes, these ones especially are the ones who come through Kampala. They are the ones that go through individual status determination to ascertain whether they meet the criteria to be granted status in Uganda. There is an interministerial committee that looks at their claims, and then before they are granted status or they are rejected. Yes, I think that's it.
Okay, thank you so very much. I'm sure we are going to take the occasion to listen to the person of insights to the question of returnees and deportees. We also have Madame Agnes Igoye in our midst here, and she sits at a very appropriate office, which has most of the answers to some of the puzzles so far had, all the way from Rachel's presentation to now. I think it is fair that we listen to Agnes a little bit before we can get the third panelist.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to the panelists. I don't know how much time I have. Okay, I think next time it would have been nice if we made a presentation to make an overview, because listening, to the team, since morning and all that, most of these things would have been actually covered. Because under my office, which is a creation of the Trafficking Persons Act, Section 21, it gives the Minister of Internal Affairs to create an office where I'm the deputy. So this office monitors, coordinates all aspects of the Prevention of Trafficking Persons Act. Under that office, we have 13 ministries, departments, and agencies, which constitute a task force, which is represented, ODPP, various gender, ISO, ESO, Interpol, all those agencies. And under that office, one of the key things, Rachel has talked about, the issues of the database, which we want to really coordinate so that everybody feeds into it. We, annual action plans, we have a new annual action plan, national action plan, where, all aspects of trafficking are anchored, national referral guidelines. And the representatives in the task force are actually expected to go to their different departments. And creating of that national action plan, it was at the highest level in which even permanent secretaries and directors sat in an office like this one to say this is what we are committed, because all people have to commit on what they are supposed to do under that act. And having people at that level means that you actually have to commit even resources. NGOs are represented on that task force in there. Now, there's a very dangerous narrative in this country, which I'm really, scared of, because there's this dangerous branding that recruitment agencies are the ones causing trafficking. And majority of the cases we receive are actually people who go outside that narrative. And there's this excitement. We know that there's a lot of challenges in the Middle East, but the majority of trafficking is in our country. But there's this, because they are in the middle, which is great, the media, but we also, point a lot of fingers there and we forget. How many people come to your home to ask your house girl what's going on? The challenge we have is that the issues of domestic labor, domestic work is downgraded. There's no value attached to it globally, wherever you go. It's because it is women. And you remember when we stopped people to go to the Middle East on domestic work, it didn't stop it. It just went underground. It became worse. Sometimes I think if domestic work was done by men, oh my God, there would be so many bilaterals. There would be, even the money on domestic work would be a lot. If it was men in domestic work. So the energy we put in professions, which men do, even in our homes, who is in charge of the domestic workers? It's the shamba boy who earns even more. But because this one works in the home, so how do we value, how do we see the work women, do? So there's so much, in there. And I'm glad that people are talking about training and all that under the Better Migration Program, because training, we want to trap it at training academies. So police, we are developing that, you have representatives who will develop that curriculum. Then also at immigration, because everybody must be trained in everything. It's not just because there are transfers, all the time as we move there. I would have commented in so many things. People even talked about victims being arrested, and charged. Yes, it comes also with training, because victims are made to commit crimes, fraudulent documents, forging documents, in prostitution and all that. So the more we train our officers, the more they know that victims are not supposed to be penalized in those instances. So statistics, yes, of course, when you talk about statistics, those are just estimates. Globally, those will remain, because it is an underground activity. So a total of 214 incidents were registered, for example, from January up to December 2020. But we all know that during lockdown, the majority of the trafficking was in-house. It wasn't in the Middle East. How many girls got pregnant? And also the narrative on what we constitute as trafficking. We tend to, because it is in the Middle East, domestic work, the use of children in armed conflict, child marriages. As long as a child is pregnant, that is evidence, And so we are looking at other, lifting up other issues and leaving other underground things that really are affecting us also. Let's go in unison and make sure that, the narrative out there, whether it is media, constant engagement of the media and all that, so that we move. We all know, I'm glad the commissioner mentioned it, how export of labor started in this country. Actually started from Iraq. You remember? When the Americans took people, to Iraq. So when those guards came back, they had money. So people got excited. So even the traffickers want underground. We are not a labor exporting country. And when we talk even on bilateral labor agreements and all that, it's not Uganda is not going to be the first. There are countries who have been ahead of us, but they are still struggling. No one will go to the Middle East and go home to home looking out on how your Ugandans are faring. Every home, that how are you doing? So continuous improvement is what is going to happen, but we are not going to have like 100%. How many of us wake up in the morning and you are really fed up of your employer, whether in government or what? So there are mixed things. So there's a mixture, labor, people are mixing it up. There are people who are stranded abroad, they call it trafficking. If you get poor relationships at work and all that, they call it trafficking. So we have to know what is trafficking, and then we really anchor that. And the reason why refugees have not been on the radar, because we are making a lot, we are right now, Middle East, there's no research and all that, but doesn't mean that refugees are not affected. Dig deep and look at it critically and get evidence and data, because that is what is going to work. But the moment we continue every day singing about Middle East alone, we are doing badly. I thank you.
Thank you so very much. I told you now the Sigiri is really lit. Not only is forced migration gendered, Agnes is telling us human trafficking too is gendered. Now what does this mean to interrogate a gendered phenomenon like this one? I think this is a very important question. We've been told, before Agnes could sum it up, that 68% of the offenders of trafficking persons, 68 are male. We have also been told 70% of the victims are female. We've been told 75% are domestic cases. We've been told of the 342 cases, only 11 are convicted. We've been told asylum seekers are predominantly female and children. We've been told those who transit are predominantly male. We are in the mix of offenders gendered, perpetrators gendered, victims and survivors are gendered beings. So, how do we start apportioning a solution that is all gender involved, but not necessarily one at the expense of the other? I think it's a very important food for thought, because we are born gendered beings, and we cannot just have a gender-blind conversation about these things. Let's have our third panelist, Professor Siobhan Mlali, who has gracefully given us a video. So all the lights will be dimmed, we shall get the video, and then we shall process, together with the previous speakers, the question and answer session. All right. We have in our online participation a good representation from the Coalition Against Trafficking in Persons of Uganda, coordinated by Sarah Kakai. She is a member of the National Task Force, which is really under the care of Agnes Igoye. We are so glad that for once we are the roundabout where civil society in its understanding meets the state. And I think this is the most productive dialogue so far as we forge a way forward. I think we can help our panelists should also get the good view. Please join the.
I hope that all is going well, and before not too long we will be able to join together in person. I'm going to speak very briefly this morning about the UN Special Procedures, and specifically the role of the UN Special Rapporteur on trafficking in persons, and then look in a little bit more detail about the particular difficulties being faced at the moment in addressing trafficking in persons in the context of COVID-19, the situation of the pandemic, and the particular risks that are faced by refugees, migrants, internally displaced persons, people displaced by conflict or for other reasons. And I really welcome this opportunity to again join with the Refugee Law Project in highlighting the gaps that exist in identifying potential victims of trafficking, people who have already become victims of trafficking in the context of forced migration, and in particular in refugee and asylum seeking communities. And again, the purpose of this is to try to break down the silos in which we often operate in engaging in humanitarian action or programming or project work, in missing indicators of trafficking, in failing to identify potential victims at an early stage, and ensuring effective prevention and protection. So I'm just going to give a very short introduction first to the role of the Special Rapporteur and the UN Special Procedure System. And again, this is really to highlight the importance of engaging with the special procedures and the role of NGOs and civil society and other actors in trying to engage to use the special procedures system to effect change on the ground. And that can be through policy reform, legislative reform, changes in practice, or in highlighting specific instances of human rights violations. And it's a relatively simple process to engage with the special procedures. The website of the mandate of Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons is posted there on the slide. The email of the mandate, SR Trafficking, and the other special procedures is similar, whether it's SR Migrants, SR Sale and Sexual Exploitation of Children. There are opportunities to engage with them and encourage them, request them, or ask them to respond urgently to a situation on the ground and to try to bring about reform or change or reparations or remedies. So my mandate, the Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, has a gender dimension. It is especially women, but that does not confine it to only working with women who are victims of trafficking. It highlights a specific gender dimension, and it also has a very specific child rights dimension. It's all forms of exploitation, so sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, exploitation and forced criminality or forced begging. And the primary focus of the Special Rapporteur mandate is to promote the prevention of trafficking in persons and to really focus on protecting the human rights of victims. So it's trying to bring together the range of international, regional, and domestic human rights law standards to better enhance the protection of victims of trafficking. The approach is set out briefly there, the so-called 5 Ps that focus on partnerships, protection, prevention, promoting human rights and international cooperation. And then the 3 Rs, redress, rehabilitation, reintegration, again, supporting the human rights of victims of trafficking. And the 3 Cs, capacity, coordination, cooperation. So that's cooperation with civil society, with really critically important organizations such as the Refugee Law Project, and also cooperation with UN agencies and with government and public policy bodies on the ground. There are different ways in which the special rapporteurs engage. That can be a thematic engagement to focus on a particular issue through country visits, normally 2 per year. That's not happening at the moment, but we hope to restart the country visits later this year. And finally, communications, and I'm going to say a little bit more about communications. Communications are received from civil society, can be from UN agencies, can be from individuals, can be from trade unions, bringing information to the attention of the special procedures, and then the special procedures can respond, engage with governments or engage with non-state actors such as businesses and companies and try to effect change. One of the areas of priority work for my mandate currently is looking at the intersections between trafficking in persons and displacement. And forced displacement, as we know, increases the risks of trafficking because it may mean that family support or community support structures that are normally present are broken down. And this can put people, and particularly children, at greater risk if those ordinary everyday protection networks are not there. Also, in the context of displacement, there's increased risk of people being in a situation where they don't have documentation, have more limited access to regular formal education, limited resources, and other opportunities for self-reliance or employment may be more limited. And in that context, people who are at greater risk of poverty, including those who are displaced, may be targeted by trafficking networks or groups or by informal networks. And the main recommendations, and you'll be hearing more about this throughout the seminar and roundtable, but what the Refugee Law Project and what we've been trying to do in cooperating and working together is to ensure that attention to questions around trafficking are integrated into all humanitarian interventions or life-saving protection activities from the outset of a conflict or crisis situation. So including a human rights-based anti-trafficking response and programming into existing clusters for humanitarian action and programming. In terms of engaging with the special procedures then, just very briefly to comment on the communications process, because as I've highlighted before, I think in speaking with the Refugee Law Project, we get very few communications from Africa broadly. So this is a concern in that there isn't as great an awareness of how to effectively use the communications procedures. We can send joint communications, we can work with other mandate holders, and the purpose of the communications are to initially obtain clarification on what has happened or what may be happening in terms of a pending reform or an unfolding situation or gaps in provision of services, and then to try to promote effective measures to protect the human rights of victims of trafficking or potential victims. It's not a judicial process or even quasi-judicial. So that means that unlike the human rights treaty bodies or other international mechanisms, it's not necessary to exhaust domestic remedies. So it's more flexible, and there can be greater possibility to respond quickly to an unfolding situation. There are different types of communications, letters of allegation. This is where human rights violations have allegedly already taken place, and then a government is asked to investigate and punish alleged perpetrators or provide compensation and protection to victims. An urgent appeal can be where there's an impending situation, a threatening situation with grave human rights violations unfolding. And there the government is asked urgently to take measures to prevent or stop the alleged violations. Then what's sometimes referred to as other letters, these can be letters addressing unfolding legislation, can be addressing a policy debate, for example, on labour externalization or on the role of recruitment agencies or protection of migrant domestic workers. And this can aim to contribute to a process of legislative or policy reform, or it can be around practices and procedures, a new national action plan, concerns around a national referral mechanism and how it's working. The communications do not necessarily immediately become public. An urgent appeal does become public after a short time given to the government to respond, and then the communication and the response is published. The letters of allegation give 60 days before becoming public, and other letters which are to contribute to an unfolding law reform process, those become public immediately. So, for example, last week we were contributing to a process of law reform in South Korea, concerns around gaps in protection, and we issued a letter and that became public immediately. We issued letters of allegation against 57 countries in relation to people detained in camps in northern Syria, and concerns around gaps in protection and repatriation of those persons, some of whom are victims of trafficking or potential victims. And those just became public last weekend. So that work is ongoing. Who can submit information? This is quite broad, so it can be NGOs, it can be UN agencies, it could be trade unions. It must be a reliable source. We can't respond to media reports only, so we need information in from reliable sources. And then the communications from the special procedures are sent to governments or non-state actors. As I said, it could be businesses, tech companies, it can be intergovernmental organizations, multinational corporations. the information is submitted on this information is on the website, and the link is there also on the slide. So again, I would encourage people to think about how to engage effectively with the special procedures and whether communications might be a useful way of engaging with the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Trafficking or Special Rapporteur on Migrants to engage with the government to bring about reform or policy change. The information that is included, precise information around the specific concerns, or it may be around an unfolding policy or legislative development. And if it's in relation to a specific human rights violation, then it's important to ensure that the consent of the victim concerned is provided. So to move on then, and just to speak a little bit about the context for the round table and the ongoing discussions around the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, this is something that my mandate has addressed jointly with other special procedures, including in particular the Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants. The COVID-19 pandemic, as we have seen, is exacerbating existing inequalities. The particular concern in relation to heightened risks of trafficking arises from increased risks of extreme poverty. So some of the information that we are receiving and that is now being documented suggests the possibility of more than 100 million people moving into extreme poverty, so-called new poor, and that is to refer to those who were expected to move out of, no longer be considered to be living in situations of extreme poverty, and that being reversed as a result of the outbreak of COVID-19. And this has very specific regional dimensions, so specifically affecting South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, and the Pacific regions. And there are gender dimensions to the poverty and inequality increases that we are seeing and potentially seeing. And we know from previous experience, in particular with the Ebola virus outbreak, that women, particularly women working in the informal sectors, may be disproportionately affected and disproportionately negatively affected through loss of employment, loss of income in agriculture and small businesses, in informal trade settings, and that having a knock-on impact on families, communities, increased poverty and precariousness in terms of the situations in which families and communities find themselves. The other context is with border closings, border closures, that the possibilities that there may be for seeking employment overseas, fair employment, decent work, that is increasingly restricted because borders are closed, and that can also lead to reversals in economic empowerment, in particular for women. And then pre-existing vulnerability factors, in particular affecting adolescent girls, for example, there may be heightened vulnerability to sexual exploitation and forced marriage. And for boys and men, increased risk of recruitment into armed conflict or into forced labor or other trafficking-related practices. Specifically linked to migration then, what we have seen is reduced security, law enforcement bodies and agencies, resources being diverted elsewhere, leading to a situation of insecurity, disruption of protection, disruption in provision of services to migrant workers, to victims of trafficking, and associated confinement measures also increasing those risks of gaps in terms of provision of services and protection and supports. Discrimination based on sex or gender may be exacerbated in situations of conflict, in situations of crisis such as the pandemic. And there again, we see these trends repeating in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So those are the kinds of trends that we are seeing at the moment. And one of the difficulties that we are also facing is that there are significant challenges in documenting and reporting on what is currently happening, precisely because of the restrictions being imposed by the pandemic. But I think it is critical now that we strengthen all efforts to really identify the risks of trafficking, to step up prevention and protection efforts, and to try to ensure that we learn from mistakes of previous situations of crisis, such as the Ebola outbreak, such as what we see happening in situations of crisis. And that different agencies, different actors, different projects and programs work together to try to ensure early identification of potential victims of trafficking, referral for protection, and more effective cooperation between different partners, including with UN special procedures and UN agencies on the ground. So I hope that we can continue working together on this. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Mlali. Siobhan is online and she's gonna stick with us for some time. Let's launch our Q&A, and we can also have the benefit of having her also to respond to some of these important questions which we have been registering all along. It's a conversation that has moved from the nexus between those who just came to be known as forced migrants to now becoming humanly trafficked, and now being thrown into the new poor. And we are understanding from Siobhan, I think, that the new normal has ushered us into a new phenomenon. We have now the new normal with the new poor, the new exploited, the new displaced, the new officers, the new academics. We do not know how much new is new in this new phenomenon. But it seems that the trend has been going on, and COVID has accelerated it to unprecedented levels. I'm sure we have questions. I'm going to register a basket of them, and then we shall hear from our different panelists. We are in our last hour of our half-day dialogue. So I will really beg us to have very condensed questions. At very most, 2 questions, brief one. But I will appreciate if you can ask only one question, so that we can give our panelists ample time to also respond. I will start with those online. There's been a question which has been going on for the last, there's a question which has hanged on the chat, and it is directed to Mr. Mondo. It is 3-in-1 question. One participant named Favor Ofia, a PhD candidate from the Institute, from the IRIS Center for Human Rights, says, what goes into the drafting process for these bilateral agreements? 1, are migrant workers and representative organizations consulted in the process? 2, you also mentioned having labor attaché in all countries where Uganda has bilateral agreement with. How about Ugandans who are working in other countries in the Middle East and the Gulf states? 3, and lastly, have any private recruitment agency been identified as contributing to the exploitation of migrant workers at any stage of the externalization process? How has justice been served? Those are the 3 questions from Favor Ofia, our very good friend and partner in this research project. I'm going to take other questions from within the physical room, and the panelists will be writing down.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moderator. I would like to thank the panelists for their presentations. My question goes to Commissioner Mondo Chateka. He has correctly analyzed the unemployment problem in this country, and he has also prescribed some solutions to this problem. However, my question is, I don't see deliberate steps being taken by government to address this question head on. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, David. There is a question at the back, another one here.
Thank you. My name is Naima of Kenya from Platform for Labour Action. Mine also goes to Mr. Commissioner Mondo on the presentation regarding externalization. Yes. I'm concerned about the situation, the COVID-19 situation when the sector was shut down. I'm sure that we had migrant workers that were about to travel to work abroad, and were those whose contracts were about to end while they were working in the different countries. I'm wondering whether the government or the ministry has come up with any guidelines to address that phase where companies had a number of people who were supposed to travel and those that were supposed to return. Because while you were presenting, you mentioned that there were companies that were suspended from operation, about 11 of them, and some of the issues or the concerns are that they failed to comply with some of the requirements to operate the recruitment agencies. And now I'm wondering which companies, have the companies been compliant since the sector was opened, since the time that we resumed work, I believe around January. So can you let us know whether there are any guidelines to manage that situation?
Well, thank you. So far it's a buffet for Commissioner Mondo. We have also Dalson, who has been on the panel. We also have Professor Mlal Shivon on the panel. So let us also have the question to them too. There's a question here, and there's another one.
Thank you, moderator. Happy Ainomgisha from Oxford. My question goes to Commissioner. Yes, in his presentation, he mentioned about 200 something registered organizations that are supposed to handle the workers who are going to these different countries that he mentioned. I would like to know whether these registered organizations, how they are monitored to adhere to the guidelines, procedures as they take these people across, and also which measures are in place in case there are cases of sexual exploitation, because we've seen, especially in our different platforms, what women go through. What measures are in place to make sure that the survivors are responded to on time? Thank you.
Thank you. My question also goes to Commissioner Mondo. I'm sorry. As you are aware, at the immigration, especially at the passport section, we've been having endless lines of young women trying to acquire passports so that they can go and seek employment. My question, therefore, is how many countries have we signed labor externalization agreements with? And if we have, what are the procedures that these labor companies go through in order to send out what do they go through for them to be able to go to these countries? And if so, how many have succeeded there, so that we can actually be able to say this one was successful and this one was not? Thank you.
Wow. Yes, Commissioner. Two more questions here, but let's first, three more questions, and then we shall. Oh, wow, there's another one. I will take the question. Let's be brief.
Mine too. I'm Daisy Navasitu, a PhD. Okay. I'm Daisy Navasitu, a PhD candidate at National University of Ireland, and I'm actually researching on migrant domestic workers who are subjected to labor exploitation in the Middle East countries, and taking Uganda as my case study. So, Mr. Commissioner, I'm interested in knowing what enforcement mechanisms are in place to ensure that the bilateral labor agreements that are signed actually protecting these migrant workers in the destination countries. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Daisy, for that brevity. We're going to have another one.
Thank you so much. My name is Maria. I'm coming from LASPNet, Legal Aid Service Providers Network. My question also goes to Commissioner. It's a simple one. He mentioned that so far there are 11 firms or organizations that have been deregistered. I wanted to know whether, apart from deregistering the companies, is there a form of, are they prosecuted, are members prosecuted? And if so, what is the status?
Thank you. There is another one here.
Thank you so much. I'm Hanja Batara DC. With the external labor, you can have another day or 2 days for that. It cannot end. I also want to ask from the Prime Minister representative on the issues of refugees. Is there any arrangement, a policy or a strategy being designed internationally or nationally that can see that the rate of the refugees are reduced? Thank you so much.
Thank you. And lastly, last but one, we shall have Agnes and then.
Thank you very much. I wanted this to go to the special rapporteur. I don't know whether they're still online. Thank you very much. I think the biggest monster we have as sending countries is really, that demand for cheap labor, abroad. We know that there's a lot of stringent visa policies. We know that there's market for what they are terming cheap labor. I don't even know low-skilled labor. I don't know what is low-skilled, for example, about sending, domestic workers. And I know that there's a lot of politicization on migration and deliberate effort. Because whenever you talk about fixing migration policies, especially in destination countries, it's not popular. We know that walls don't work. We know that banning labor export does not work. That there is market for low-skilled labor abroad, whether you want it or not. But companies want to continue making it cheap and making it illegal, quote unquote, illegal. But if it was opened up, there is market for everybody, and people would move. So I don't know what levels of engagement are there in destination countries, because we are just talking about the Middle East, but there are other countries where Ugandans have gone to. The only thing is that the stringent labor policies make sure that our people cannot go there, and yet there is market. Yes. So what are those procedures of engaging people at destination? Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Agnes. Let's have a final question here, and then we shall get back to the panelists.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Godfrey Ogena, and I work with the Jesuit Refugee Service. So my question will go to Rachel, but is also open to any member of the panel who is ready to answer it. So I was looking at the shadow report submitted by Human Rights to the UN about trafficking in Uganda, but in relationship to labor externalization. I looked at the trafficking figures for children, and the numbers are worrying. Like internally, the cases of internal trafficking, we had almost 92 male children and 207 females. Then the transnational, we had 48 male and 36. So those figures are worrying. But then one challenge I notice is within the legal framework, in that there are some challenges connected to what they call the Child Amendment Act of 2016, which seems not to be in harmony with the Anti-trafficking Act. So because of that, there are problems, for example, with the definition of, for example, child sex trafficking, which what qualifies to make an incident child trafficking is the use of force, fraud, or coercion. And therefore, if there is disharmony in the legal framework, then it becomes very difficult to prosecute these cases. So I would like to know what steps have been taken to harmonize this Child Amendment Act of 2016 with the 2009 Anti-trafficking Act, so that the legal framework allows, prosecution of those who traffic in children. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Godfrey. We're going to start with Dalson, who has one question specifically directed to her. Then we shall move to Professor Mlali, who has two questions directly posed to her, and then we shall come back to the buffet eater. Briefly, nobody. We are launching into our final panel, and I'm sure we're going to have another 30 minutes of now Q&A. Dalson.
Thank you. The question was on policy on reduction of refugees. Incidentally, we have a very welcoming and open policy to refugees, and when they come, they are welcome and settled within the gazetted government land. And where government has identified land from the generous landowners in West Nile, where the refugees are being hosted. So I don't think the government of Uganda is about to have a policy on reduction of refugees, but rather keep welcoming them. Thank you.
Thank you for that brevity. We're going to hear Professor Mlali.
Thank you very much, David, and good morning to everyone. Thank you for the questions and comments. Specifically with regard to the question about engaging in destination countries, not only countries of origin, of course that is something that we do all the time, and it is a critical concern to ensure that international legal obligations around protection of migrant workers are effectively implemented on the ground. Obviously, enforcement of international law in domestic law settings is always going to be a challenge, but we engage through the UN Human Rights Treaty body system, the various UN Human Rights Treaty bodies, as well as through the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons. And a key process that is ongoing at the moment is the engagement with the Global Compact on Migration, which specifically tries to expand safe, orderly and regular migration routes. And as the speaker noted, the question highlights the fact that if people are pushed into irregular modes of migration, there's increased risk of exploitation. But even in regular modes of migration, certain workers are categorized as low-skilled or unskilled and may fall outside of protection in some countries, for example, where you've limited labour inspections or where domestic households are not subject to oversight and inspection, or where the labour laws don't apply to a domestic household. The same is also can be a problem, for example, in agricultural settings. And here the role of embassies is really critical. So it was good to hear about the bilateral agreements and the commitment to ensuring the protection of nationals abroad, because consular services, the role of embassies in advising migrant workers, in providing information, in ensuring that there is access to protection, including repatriation, compensation, protection on return, and long-term social inclusion, rehabilitation. But the critical thing really in the first place is prevention. So that means really strict oversight and regulation of recruitment agencies, looking at what kinds of job offers are being made, and then engaging, and certainly within the UN system, we are engaging with destination countries to not just to send people back, close borders, and prosecute traffickers, which is important for accountability, but also to ensure that those who are survivors, victims, can stay if they wish, have access to fair employment, decent work, receive compensation for the human rights violations suffered. So the Global Compact on Migration, for example, the regional reviews are ongoing at the moment. The regional review in the African region is coming up. And there certainly, I'm trying to engage there as well to continue to push on the importance of expanding access to safe, orderly, regular migration routes and decent work for migrant workers. And that links in also to the comments about refugees. Uganda has a very strong tradition of welcoming refugees, which is critically important in protecting against exploitation, because we know that if people have to find unsafe routes to escape persecution or flee conflict, they're also more at risk of exploitation, including trafficking. So that opening up and welcoming refugees and hosting refugees is hugely important. And then I think what this discussion is also about is ensuring that refugees on arrival are protected, that any victims or potential victims of trafficking are identified at an early stage and referred for protection and assistance. And that prevention mechanisms are built in the same way that we see increasing engagement with questions of sexual and gender-based violence in camps or settlements, or also for urban refugees. So it's about bringing that together, but a critically important thing is making migration safe, more open, and expanding opportunities, including for employment, but decent work, fair work, and ensuring that that is enforced also in the destination countries, including in the Gulf region, but also, of course, in Europe and Southeast Asia. We know can be a destination country also for some Ugandan migrant workers who go to work in hospitality, for example, but are then forced into prostitution, and all of the difficulties that that brings. So it's really important to track that and to continue engage also with countries of destination. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Mlali. I think this is very illuminating. I will beg that you stay with us for a moment if you can, but we really appreciate your presence and your answer to that question. We have a third panelist who has received a whole basket of questions, but Mondo, you are not under obligation to pass or fail this question. You deliberate on which one you're going to answer, and the conversation will continue. We have a final plenary session, and I'm sure Mondo will come back again.
You see, if I don't answer, they will say we paid this man at the end of the month. Why doesn't he answer? And the office of the Prime Minister is here also to see whether I can answer or not. So let me try. I'll answer those that I can, and I can refer others. I didn't get the name, but she says she's a PhD candidate. What goes into the drafting of these bilaterals? The drafting in government normally is handled by the first parliamentary council, and these are lawyers, and their job is to draft instruments that have to do with government of any nature. But of course they do consultation with the Solicitor General, there is clearing here and there, But again, they don't do it alone. They highly consult with other stakeholders. So they work with us as Minister of Gender. They work with the intending or those organizations that work into externalization of labor. And at the end of the day, we come up with the bilateral. No bilateral comes into implementation without clearance by the Solicitor General. That's the legal mind behind how he consults with other bodies, with the solicitor, with the other legal minds. That's their business. But we do consult. But you know, documents are documents. There will always be a loophole here or there, and you work on improving them, and with time they become not perfect, but near to perfect. Also asked about, we talked about liaison officers that we are in a process of recruiting, and asks about what about Ugandans working elsewhere. Those for now, the embassies in those areas, they hope us to handle what would have been handled by a liaison officer. We are posting these liaison officers in those areas because the numbers are magnanimous. And if we say one officer at the embassy, the first secretary or second secretary, then it means he will not do any other job apart from labor externalization. So we thought it's important to have a liaison officer to handle. Has any registered externalization of labor been a victim of some of the vices? I think there was one. I don't quite remember. And the case has been going on. You know, the issue, the legal minds here, they say you must prove. He who alleges must prove. And that takes a lot of time, you know, before you convict. So I think there was one incident, but I don't quite remember. I will investigate and find out whether there are more than that. But even one case is bad enough. It's bad enough. It's a betrayal of the trust invested in that organization. My friend here from Uganda Prison Services, he says with him, he does not see. Where is the man? I will have to get back to that when he's around, because I can't answer that one when he's not here. Migrant workers who were about to travel and then COVID descended on us, and those who were about to come back, you see there was a problem. They had those who were out there, they had to stay there until when the situation was a little better for them to come back. And those who were to travel were put on hold until the situation, you know, improved for them to travel. And you say, what about in cases where the default? All the companies that are licensed, they deposit a certain amount of money. That money, among other things, will cater for those eventualities. That you took money from Mondo, who was supposed to travel, and you didn't service him to travel. And so that money is charged. My colleague from Ministry of Internal Affairs, acquisition of passports. You see, acquisition of passport is a right. Even if these people didn't want to travel anywhere, they have a right to have the passport. What you have to do at Ministry of Internal Affairs is, I think, to streamline your method of issuing these passports. Because I really sympathize with these people. You know, I used to quarrel with people who were looking for visas, where people could go at 4 to line up. Now, you people in Ministry of Internal Affairs, you are doing the same. I pass that road every day, and you find people in big lines. I don't know whether they are part of those who want to travel to Middle East, but I know there are so many people out there. Whether they intend to go for labor externalization or for other things, I don't know. But what I know that even if I didn't want to travel, I'm entitled to a passport. I can get it, keep it, and use it as and when I want to use that passport. The countries with whom we have bilateral, I mentioned Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. The countries we are about to sign bilaterals with, I mentioned Qatar, Bahrain, and Turkey. Those are likely to be signed anytime. I think we have agreed on the nitty-gritty within those bilaterals. DAISY, enforcement mechanisms to ensure protection of migrant workers. Yes, I said that we have one liaison officer for now in Saudi Arabia. We intend to recruit for all the countries with whom we signed bilaterals. But for now, we use the embassies also to help us. But also there is a team of officers who regularly do the monitoring. But then there's also reports that always come, either from individuals, of somebody being harassed, of somebody who was locked up in whatever. But then sometimes those people don't report directly to us. Sometimes they hearsay, and when you say, can we get the report? Can somebody report? People are shy about it. I'm facing the same problem with youth who access youth livelihood program. They say that some people who administer, who have to give them the money, they ask for a cut. You say, please, why don't you bring it to our attention? And we deal with the vice. The person does not want to turn up. Because I know that the person giving and the person getting, they are both corrupt. Maybe that's what they fear. But they never turn up when you want to see how you can intervene. Happy, I think to know Mugisha. I know Mugisha. Yes, I said 2009 farms. How they are monitored, that's what I've been belaboring to explain. Measures on sexual exploitation, the measures we apply on the other cases is the same as what we apply on sexual exploitation. Now to my colleague from prisons, I think, okay.
I think, yeah. Thank you so very much, Commissioner. I think it is 30th of March and you have so far ably earned your salary. Answering these questions, you have definitely earned your salary. I can confirm. We are going to our last section of our program for this half-day dialogue, and it's going to be ushered by yet another important voice in this conversation about human trafficking and forced displacement. We are graced to have from the virtual room Samantha McCormack. Samantha McCormack is an associate legal specialist in charge of anti-trafficking global protection cluster. She's a lawyer with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. She's currently the focal point for anti-trafficking in global protection cluster. The cluster is led by the UNHCR, as we all know, and it consists of 1,000 members working on protection in internal displacements settings, including UN agencies, international organizations, and other national non-governmental organizations. So she's online and she's going to have a comment from the Anti-trafficking task force, which she chairs, and she's going to briefly hint on the moment we are in, trafficking in person and COVID-19. So I will ask the ICT. I think we can discharge the panelists to join the seats, and we shall come back to a very conclusive Q&A after listening to Samantha McCormack. Please.
Thank you so much for having me, and colleagues, it has been wonderful to hear your interventions and other speeches today. I hope you can hear me and understand me okay. I'm living in Switzerland, but I'm an Australian, so I have a very strong accent. I will just briefly share my screen with you for my PowerPoint presentation. One moment. Okay, I hope you can see this okay. So as mentioned in that very kind introduction, the Global Protection Cluster that some of you might know already is activated in internal displacement contexts. And so the whole concept is that instead of each humanitarian agency working individually, that the protection cluster brings together various protection agencies for a stronger protection response. I sit in the team in headquarters in the Global Protection Cluster, looking after these national protection clusters. And of course, we have the usual pillars of a protective response, which is child protection, gender-based violence, housing, land and property, and mine action. But what we really discovered, and as I'm sure many of you working on trafficking have, is that trafficking has tended to be quite an overlooked issue in the humanitarian protection response. So as a result, IOM and UNHCR got together in 2017 to start a task force looking specifically at trafficking in internal displacement contexts. And I think as several colleagues have discussed today, oftentimes there's a misperception that we think about trafficking as people being trafficked abroad, but certainly what we started to notice in emergency contexts, in climate-related disasters and in conflict settings, people were being trafficked within the displacement setting and the conflict setting itself, also to other parts of the country where they might be safer. So about our task team, we've operated for about 5 years now. There are 13 NGOs, international organisations and UN agencies that are a part of our team. In addition to representatives from the child protection areas of responsibility and the gender-based areas of responsibility. Because of course, the idea is not to create a separate anti-trafficking response in the humanitarian community, but it's about embedding anti-trafficking action in the responses that already occur. Essentially, I just want to hit you with a little bit of data we have. When we started out in 2018, we surveyed the then 29 protection clusters, so the clusters that existed in various emergencies around the world. And we discovered that only 5 protection clusters were actively working on trafficking. And as you can see in the graph here, 50% of the clusters either didn't know anything about trafficking in persons or what was occurring, and another half only had some anecdotal information. So this touches on some of the issues that other colleagues have mentioned, that data is a key issue in our anti-trafficking fight. This is something, collecting data, that we've really tried to shift in the Global Protection Cluster. We actually wrote a report that came out in November last year, looking at trafficking in the various clusters. And we found that 66% of the 35 protection clusters that currently exist are reporting trafficking as a current protection risk. Our latest data from February this year indicates now 71% of protection clusters are reporting trafficking as a risk. And we're also seeing associated phenomenon such as forced recruitment and forced labour and child marriage are also on the rise. And of course, also something that the Special Rapporteur touched upon is that we're also seeing in particular that adolescent girls have a heightened vulnerability to trafficking in persons, in particular to harmful practices that might have previously existed before the pandemic that are now being escalated. So we're seeing the exchange and sale of girls to pay off family debts, early marriage of girls. In some operations, we're seeing what is being labelled as forced puberty, where young prepubescent girls are being given hormones to accelerate puberty and therefore their marriageability. So all of these phenomena are closely interlinked with trafficking in persons. Essentially, what we discovered in the task team was that many humanitarians are quite unfamiliar with what trafficking in persons is. So I guess we have really shared the same challenges that many of you have in Uganda with training police and training the judiciary, that there was a real gap in understanding of humanitarian responders in knowing how to respond to trafficking in internal displacement contexts. So at the end of last year, our task team published this introductory guide to anti-trafficking in IDP contexts. And we really tried to break down how to respond to trafficking by looking at what the issue is and the roles of responders, what a strong prevention and protection response might look like in a crisis, and then some operational guidance for identifying, referring and managing cases. Of course, this guide covers the basics about what trafficking in persons is, and it also provides some tools and some case studies. So we have, for example, a list of indicators that humanitarians might use. And we also look at examples of small task teams that are working on trafficking in humanitarian settings. Between humanitarians and the protection cluster.
Oh, thank goodness.
So I really invite you, if you're interested or if you're working on the trafficking response in Uganda, to have a look at this guide. I'm really interested then in hearing this session today that there's new guidance from Uganda on how to respond. I think this tool is, this guidance is a great tool for people within the development community, within the peace and legal and judicial community to work more closely with humanitarians. Because obviously the greatest thing is trying to break down these silos between the humanitarian response and from the other anti-trafficking responses that might exist in a country. For our task team next, evidence. So much for the presentation. the links to the November report and the new guidance on trafficking in IDP settings. And of course, if anyone has further questions or wants to connect with me or the Global Protection Cluster Task Team, please feel free to reach out. Thanks so much.
Thank you so very much, Samantha. We experienced some power cuts in the presentation, but at least we were able to follow very religiously the key points you have raised. Thank you so very much, Sam. We're gonna launch our final question and answer. This is a plenary session. Can you have lights back on, please? This is our very final one, and between our lunch and our insights lies this Q&A. I promise you it's going to be short, but it is also important that we wind up by giving as much opportunity to everyone who has really soldiered on from the beginning to now to get some of these questions just put across. We may never really get answers or solution to go back with at our workplace, but at least let's be troubled enough, or let's trouble the waters enough as food for thoughts. I'm going to start with something which really struck me. There is something which struck me from Sam's presentation. She named some countries for who those governments trafficking is a really serious concern. There is Afghanistan. I don't know whether you guys noticed that's something which we need to pay close attention to. There was an Afghanistan somewhere, there was Chad, there's Colombia, there's Ethiopia, there's Libya, there's Myanmar. All those things sound a little bit far-fetched up until when I read South Sudan. I was like, hey, this is a bordering country. This is not even Ethiopia. This is Uganda's immediate neighbor. Now there is South Sudan, for which trafficking in person is a matter of serious concern according to the indicators here. We have 1.4 million refugees. We've been told about 60% of Uganda's forced migrants, or refugees to be precise, are South Sudanese. I think that is enough. That is enough writing on the wall. I think that is enough writing on the wall that we can no longer sustain two separate conversations about forced migration and human trafficking. So I want us to think about it and keep in mind. But there is a question, there are two questions which I will invite first and foremost our very own Rachel Bihole to speak to. There was a question of Godfrey which was specifically directed to Rachel. So we shall start with Rachel there. And there is a question from the online chat. There's a question in the chat room addressed to Agnes, Mondo, and of course I will extend it to Rachel as well. What will it take? This is from Solomi Awidi. Solomi Awidi is one of us at the Refugee Law Project, and she's addressing the question to three, Agnes, Mondo, as well as Rachel. What will it take for Uganda to ratify the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, the famous Palermo Protocol? Uganda noted this recommendation in the 2016 Universal Periodic Review. And with Uganda up for review this very year, what has been done towards this? This is Solomi itching for an answer. We have another question. I think we shall start with we are going to start our final plenary session with Rachel, and then we shall come back again to Mondo, who is going to have the privilege to answer now our esteemed presenter, David. David Simba was out for a health break, a longer health break, but is now back to hear the question. Yes, Rachel.
Thank you. I think the question that was addressed to me was the disparity between the PTIP Act and the Children's Act, if I remember right. Yeah, it's true. When the Children's Amendment Act came out, there was a disparity between the definition of trafficking in children and also the punishment. However, there is an ongoing process where we're trying to harmonize these laws. And currently, as the ODPP and police, we are charging offenses of trafficking in children and also aggravated trafficking in children under the Prevention of Trafficking in Persons Act, as opposed to the Children's Act. We prefer the Trafficking Act because it's the punishment meted out to the offenders are more stringent, and also because of the protection mechanisms to the victims of trafficking. But amendments are still underway to harmonize the laws, because even the PTIP Act is also, we have some few areas where we need, where we have recommended for various amendments. Yeah, Uganda has not ratified the Palermo Protocol, and as of last year, I remember the various government agents and the civil society organizations brought this on the table, where we engaged Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Attorney General's office, to work on the efforts to have the Palermo Protocol ratified. We believe that one of the reasons why we are still under Tier 2 is because we have not yet ratified this Palermo Protocol. But of course, it also takes a lot of engagements from civil society organization and also us, government agents, to push because this is kind of a political issue that needs to be addressed, but we need to push concerted effort to push towards its ratification. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Rachel. I don't subscribe to those who believe that the law will save us, deliver us from every evil. Nevertheless, I think the Palermo Protocol is one of those legislative pieces we need to push forward. I will move the motion if it was your power to have this dialogue to mount the pressure. I think this is what the dialogue is actually about. We really want to be not just signatory to it. We need to ratify it, perhaps as one of the many steps toward the progressive agenda to counter trafficking in person. We also hope that this might be a Christmas gift. Do you think this could be a Christmas gift for us before the year 2021 ends? Anyway, let's listen to Commissioner.
Thank you. I want to start with David. David from Uganda prisons.
Not me.
Oh, you said it's David. Yes. David, don't apply the principle of selectively deciding to see what you want to see. If you don't see any kind of industrialization in Uganda, I want to invite you that I drive with you from Kampala to Jinja, and I think around Namamve, Mbarara, you will be able to see something. Even if you decide not to see, you will see something. But also, in the different towns of Jinja, Mbale, Mbarara, Soroti, they're what we call industrial parks. When you go in there are industries that have been put in place. And I said, part of the solution to unemployment is industrialization. And so, my friend David, if you don't see, then you're a sinner. But also, I talked about the service industry. And in the service industry, we talk about tourism, you talk about housing, you talk about telecommunication, you talk about transport. Many of you were old enough to remember, there used to be those green buses Were they called UTC? And that's all we had. Now, you go to down there, I don't know all of them, but you hear Gaga, you hear Soroti Kochi, you hear Global, you hear, I don't know whether you also hear them, but this is part of the service industry. Again, in the service industry when I was growing up, there was what we used to call Uganda hotels. And you know, they were scattered in a few big towns, Jinja, Soroti, you know, you could find Uganda hotel. Now, even some of you who live in Kampala, there are hotels you go to, you are invited to, and you don't know that it has been there for 10 years. As part of direct program by government to do what we call liberalization. When I was going to school again, I used to hear about one Radio Uganda. And that was it. One TV, again, it was the Uganda government. And that was it. Now you can count about 300 radio stations, count about 70 TV stations. All these are channels for employment. I don't think there is a DJ who is my age. If he's there, then he's misplaced. But all this is employment for the younger people, but also bus conductors, the drivers of these buses. All this is service industry. That's what we are talking about. Go to housing. During the governments before, we had thought that government alone can build all the housing needs of the country and you are comfortable. It was not true. We stopped with the Gorobi, then where, and it stopped. Now, everywhere you go, you find flats built under liberalization by the private sector. From the person who makes the brick, to the mason, to the electrician, to the plumber. David, isn't that employment really? Let me stop at that because David knows what he was talking about. He just wanted to pretend not to see. Of course, I could have taken you to agriculture and you see that there is some kind of modernization and commercialization via NADS, via OWC, but also via emphasis on agro-processing, adding value. My young sister, Rachel, has been able to answer the other questions. I don't want to add or subtract. But let me just say that on issues of protocols, government puts off time to examine every line. And there are protocols that they say you cannot sign with any reservation. And those becomes a problem. Where there are reservations, I can say I sign with this reservation. The same thing has happened to us in Ministry of Gender. We have not, ratified the Hague Convention. And the issue is it states without any reservation. So whatever you sign, it means you have to be concurring with everything. But it takes time sometimes, depending on how sensitive the document is. Let's pray. We don't promise you that it will be a Christmas gift, but perhaps it will be your 50th birthday gift when you make it there.
I am too young to be hopeful. I'm too old to be pessimistic. But anyway, I will take it. Maybe it will come as an Easter gift. Why not? Easter is next week. Is it even this Sunday? Thank you. Let's hear Agnes.
Thank you very much. And I know that, the issue of ratification always comes up and all that. First of all, I'm very optimistic. I'm so glad that we are not where we are a few years back, or even the other year. That the fact that we can sit here and actually deliberate and there's something done is a step in the right direction. Because I can assure you there are some countries which have not even appreciate that trafficking exists. They still think it's a political tool and all that. That if your nationals are in such a country, even engaging them becomes a challenge. because they don't even appreciate that there is trafficking. That brings me to ratifications. Yes, we've engaged, even this very year, we've done our part. A lot is going on ratification, but the thing is, on ratification, we all know that it's not the end. I mean, there are so many countries which have ratified and they are still among the worst performing. And Uganda, by the way, even before ratifying, our law is one of the strongest laws we have. It has even the death penalty. So we moved ahead. So ratification is just going to be like, to massage people who are talking, ratification. But ratifying does not mean that all of a sudden it's going to be a miracle. But it helps also in engaging and others. I wanted also to, since I have the microphone, to touch on other things that have been, talked about, passport office and all those engagements. If you realize that since passport office, started online applications, things improved so much. In fact, we started getting even feedback from people who are saying, oh, just one day and all, without knowing anyone, and removing the middlemen, those people, down there. And if you, when things are bad, they include women also. We know you. And you've noticed that 2 days ago, we opened up Mbarara. Yeah, because, it's a new system. So decongesting the center is paramount. So Mbarara is now on. And very soon you'll see, even in northern Uganda and all those regional offices, which originally used to do passports, just that it's now a new system. Then we're also moving to diaspora. Right now, they've started attaching immigration officers to missions abroad. We have 7, which is really going to beef up even, gender, issues of externalization of labor and all that is really making, government put in those measures. There's a special office right now in charge of diaspora affairs, coordinating. Now even diaspora will have even passport centers such that you don't even have to send back. Right now immigration has a courier service where your passport is delivered at the cost of immigration. So there's so much going on. The only thing is that, bad news travels faster than what? And it's not even in news. So the bad ones are the ones very, very quickly. And right now, yeah, clap. Hey, thank you so much. And immigration, by the way, because we developed the national referral guidelines, which were launched last year in July. But right now, immigration has developed their own, such that, from the border, that if you get a survivor of trafficking and all that, how do they move, and also the documentation. So that is an acknowledgement, from the directorate and how things are moving. So things are doing what? Going ahead. And we expect that even other sectors are going to what? To follow suit. So we appreciate diaspora, because first of all, even remittances from this, but feed, feed people who are bringing money to you. No, don't just look at diaspora, those ones who are working UN and what. There's a lot of money coming from even what you call, I hate that word, that low-skilled labor. There's nothing.
We have been told that only 27% represent no information whatsoever on trafficking. This is a huge percentage if you look at the pie. There is no information whatsoever globally about trafficking persons. The pie gives 23% to some anecdotal information about trafficking in persons. This is a huge percentage vis-a-vis the pie. And we have also been told about the TIP indicators, trafficking in persons indicators. I want your thoughts, your question to Samantha and the rest of the panelists before we break for lunch. Are there some burning questions, burning comments, burning suggestions which we should share, particularly linking this conversation to COVID, and the pandemic times are about to stay a little longer. So we are still in pandemic times. What does it mean for trafficking? Is it going to go online, off ground, underground? I want your questions to Samantha and to other previous presenters before we can wrap up with our lunch. Okay, let's turn to our virtual room. I think there's some questions, and the virtual participants have been extremely active, all the more active as we've been. There is a question, I think, from Dr. Chris Dolan, who is one of us, and who has been eagerly listening to this conversation for long. There is a hand up from Dr. Chris Dolan of RLP. Yes, Chris. You can unmute yourself. Yes, I can see that is Dr. Chris Dolan. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, thank you very much, David, and thank you very much, everyone, for a really wonderful round table. I've been following it online. I just wanted to just make an observation about the way the conversation has gone this morning, which I think has been very healthy, but has also highlighted how difficult it is for us to focus on the question of what's that relationship that Patricia mentioned right at the beginning between forced migration, displacement, trafficking, and then the question of gender equality, of course. And in the background behind the conversation, I've been having a conversation with the special representative, Professor Chauvin, about the need to have a more focused discussion on how do we document trafficking within refugee populations, particularly. And we've agreed in principle that we should have another event that looks just at that question, so that we really pin down we focus our gaze on why we don't have data and how can we address that? How can we begin to address that so that we can have a more evidence discussion about the extent to which trafficking is actually happening within refugee populations. And it could be happening before, it could be happening during, and it could be happening during flight, and it could be happening where people are in refugee settlements, in urban areas where they are self-settled. And of course, not just in Uganda, but in the very many other places with hosting large numbers of refugees. So I'm happy to just alert those of you who are interested that we have provisionally, we haven't set the exact date, but we have agreed that the second half of May would be a good time to have that conversation. So we shall be keeping you updated on that. And I hope that many of you will be able to join it as an online occasion, this next one, rather than as a blended event. So thank you very much again for everything today. Again, sorry for not being able to make it physically, but I think it's been a very, very constructive roundtable. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much, Chris, for your thoughtful comment. And I think it is also a way forward that whatever we're going to do here, it's a semicolon to a long sentence, which we are going to continue with into the next half of 2021. The question about the nexus is one which I think even the attendants in the room, both virtual and physical rooms, invite us to think through, because vulnerabilities have been aggrandized by COVID-19. And I think this is also the report we are getting from the anti-trafficking protection. And that nexus, I think, is a question that we need to dedicate our energies on. There is another hand. There's another hand here before we can wrap up.
Thank you. My name is Fauzia Nkunyinja. I work with International Refugee Rights Initiative. And I would like to just make a comment. I'm not asking questions. There's been too many questions, so I can just add on to the comments. One of our colleagues from NRC made a question, I think, to OPM, and she asked whether there was measures that have been put in place at reception centers to pick out people who have been trafficked. And I don't think OPM gave us an answer, or maybe they were not in the room at that point. But I don't work for OPM, and I would like to say that maybe in the past I have worked with verification systems with the UNHCR, and there is nothing specific that would basically tell you that this one is being picked out as a trafficked person or something. But because OPM introduced a verification system with the UNHCR, when children, Devote at the opening statements mentioned that there are some children that are carried from, could be transnational, or it could even be within Kampala and other regions within the country, because trafficking actually does not just happen with external regions, but it's also happening very much within the country itself. Children are fetched from the Karamajongs, brought to Kampala, or to other regions in Masindi, or wherever refugees are being resident, and they are registered onto those refugee IDs status as children that belong to another family. For anybody that has worked with refugees know that the higher the number you have in a family is the more food that you get. So they would use it for that. A family of 6 can actually get like 5 children from the neighborhood and put them on their card. But because the verification system was put in place, it's a very new progressive system that has been put in place. It would pick out those children, because a child was, before they were registering without biometrics, but now they did register with biometrics, and a child would put in her biometric and you actually see 2 names appearing on the screen. She has been registered as Esther in another family, and she has been registered as Sarah in another family. So I think that system that they introduced sort of picked out. And when you have interviews with children, they will be honest with you and they will tell you, my mother is home, or my mother is here, or something like that. So there are those mechanisms that have been put in place as an effort by the government and the UNHCR. And we can rely on these as actors to basically help us pick out these anomalies. So that's one. That was a comment. And the other thing, Chris just mentioned, we haven't been putting together the missing link, the nexus between forced displacement and trafficking. It's been there, but it hasn't been highlighted very much. And I think as civil society or people who are working on these issues, the biggest problem we have is data. We don't have the data. You don't have data, you can't do anything progressive. And as everyone in this room working on these issues, we need to put more emphasis on our efforts on having to close that link, find out the data. And we often forget even IDPs. Forced migration includes all these people, internally displaced, the stateless. These days we have environmental refugees, people who are moving because of natural disasters and things like that. And these are things that we have forgotten. But the more we leave out something, the more we fail to actually address what the problems really are. And if we put our efforts more onto this, I think we'll be able to curb these problems. Our advocacy should basically just run towards that. And another issue, refugees, yes, are trafficked. I work with ERI, but I also do consultations personally with different agencies. And I have encountered a couple of cases of refugees, especially the women. Agnes just highlighted that if the issue is basically for women, no one really pays much attention. They are pushed into these, it starts everybody in this room works as an actor. Immigration, I'm just going to talk about the case and try to hide the details, but refugee lady, they've been promised to go and work in the Middle East or in other countries. But we all know refugees do not have passports. So they go through immigration. There are these middlemen everywhere that will say, I'll get for you a passport. The most important passport a refugee would have would be a CTD, Conventional Travel Document. So they will tell them they will get that. It's an online process. That's, I think, something that the immigration also has to address. Not every refugee will have access to internet. But then they will have these people who will come in to say, I'll help you with the process. They go into that. This particular person had refugee documents but ended up being registered as a Ugandan to get a Ugandan passport instead. Because that would be the best way this person who is trafficking them, take them out of the country and go do another job elsewhere. But she still had her refugee documents. So she was registered as a Ugandan and at the same time registered as a refugee. Because the passport of a Ugandan would be the only one that would help her go to another country and do that kind of job. It ended up into sexual exploitation and so many other things. When we got the attention of this, obviously, ignorance is no defense. You can't accept a Ugandan passport when you have refugee documents, so one of those documents has to be taken away. But this also goes back to the system, not helping the victim, but maybe victimizing the perpetrator instead, and rather helping the victim. So when we do not close those small gaps, these are the other issues that arise out of this. But what the awareness I just wanted to create is that this is happening, and it's happening in many forms that will not be glaringly be exposed or shown, but they will have to use other channels because the gaps have been left there by the system. So I think that's it. And you talked about the law not being something that should help us. Signing the Palermo, we all know that international instruments are only persuasive, they're not binding. But our national laws do not even include a clause that will talk about a penalty for somebody that has trafficked a refugee. The Trafficking in Persons Act explicitly talks about vulnerable people, and I believe refugees are vulnerable. They're a case of vulnerable. I mean, you've been displaced, conflict, and then you come here and then you're forced into human trafficking. I think with a person who is going to be given a penalty, it should be grave. It should be higher, like the one of other minorities, like children. I think in the act, the one who traffics children is liable to may be liable to death or death penalty. We should maybe advocate for a clause in the act that should actually cater for refugees themselves. Thank you. I think I've talked too much.
Thanks. That's fantastic, and that's the very purpose for this closing plenary. I think there's a lot of food for thought there. Are we facing a system that victimizes the offender on the one hand and then perpetrates the survivor? I think that's a very important piece of reflection. Is there any other question before I get back to the... Yes, there was a question which was...
Thank you so much. And it would be a question, but it could also come as a comment, more related to data. And I think conversations around data are interesting. And I think if we could have roundtables of this nature, or even further, we are able to come up with things that really put evidence on the table. They could be of great help. I think the question that the officer from OPM forwarded to immigration in terms of numbers of those deported and returned has not been particularly addressed. But related to the same, I think the officer from immigration equally highlighted the task force that involves different government departments that relate to discuss and managing issues around deportation, returnees, and other categories. I think it's key that we start seeing conversations come out broadly here or in such forums, including coordination forums where we see government bodies come and join humanitarian community to discuss openly, and we see way forwards. Recently, I think we came across a case that to some extent some of the policies in the humanitarian engagement seem to have been not observed, and it relates to deportation. How are we coordinating with internally within the space we have before some of these enforcements are done? Probably these individuals that may be in country for various reasons and probably protection very pertinently could end up in the right system, particularly if there is very close coordination probably between those who are first contacts of those cases, the courts of law, OPM, and immigration, and we find long-lasting solutions. Just wanted to make that observation and comment as well.
Thank you so very much. So I think that's the worthwhile comments, and we are taking note, and our rapporteurs have been on alerts, making sure that all these voices are a little documented, so that we can have a reference when we come back to this conversation. We know we can take stock of how far we're progressing, retarding, or just stagnating. I'm going to give the final one, take-home one, to all the presenters. We are going to start with Agnes, and then we shall go to Commissioner. Rachel is not in the building, but we shall finish up with Dalson Kusasira, representing the Department of Refugees, and then we shall part for our lunch and departure at leisure. So let's start in that order with Agnes, and then we shall have Commissioner. Parting words, and we